endlessly searching for an original sin.
Surprise! Guess what's returned? That's right, I was able to fix it. So let's continue. This will be a surprise for everybody. Sure enough, it was the very person he dreaded to see. What is the button?
Jajan!
Xenia. He was grinning from ear to ear with his hands on his hips. Yuji knew he was better off ignoring him. He turned away and headed for the door.
悪い子の匂いがする。
Sir, you're creepy as fuck. The next thing Yuji knew, he was his back was against the lockers. Gonna get spicy. He looked up to find Xenia's toothy grin waiting for him. Fighting the urge to panic, Yuji looked at Xenia firmly in the eyes. You need something?
だったらどけよ。
I think he likes it here. Xenia shook his head for a second time, fed up with his antics. Yuji reached up with both hands and pushed him away.
白沼哲夫が気になるのかな？
We have our first decision, and the chat isn't here. And I can't figure out how to, uh-oh. No, I need to save. There we go. So everybody always wants us to go with the good boy route. What happens if we go bad boy? Yuji glared silently at Xenia. Xenia grinned, pleased by his reaction. Just then, the alcohol stench intensified. The smell alone was making Yuji sick. Why would Xenia ask him about Tetsuo, the Iron Man? Sorry, I know I did that joke already. It's been a while, but I know I did that joke. Yuji didn't know what he was after, but it was making him very nervous.
ねえ、何かさ、最近変わったことない？
Not really.
本当に？だったらさ、俺が占ってあげるよ。
With one hand pressed hard against Yuji's collarbone, Xenia used his other hand to fondle his chest. Yuji felt something hard slide over his nipples. Utterly repulsed, he lowered his gaze to Xenia's hand and realized that he was holding a pair of dice. Perhaps that was the source of the clacking sound he often heard in Xenia's vicinity.
これ使ってね、占うんだよ。すっごく当たるの。どれどれ？りょーちんは白沼哲夫のことを。
I didn't know you can read fortunes with dice. Cool. Unable to bear it a moment longer, Yuji shoved Xenia away. The long-haired man stumbled back a few steps, still smiling. Meanwhile, Yuji turned and dashed down the hallway. If he slowed down for even a moment, Xenia would catch him. He was sure of it. But the question is, what would Xenia do if he did catch him? The crowd of gaping onlookers scattered hastily, but Yuji paid them no mind. All he cared about was getting away from Xenia. He couldn't get that greasy voice out of his head. It made him sick to his stomach. Are you interested in him? Of course he wasn't. It had just caught him off guard hearing that name out of nowhere. But why would Xenia ask such a thing? And how did he know about Tetsuo? Well, they weren't even in the same year. With all the questions whirling through his head, he didn't notice the person in front of him until it was way too late. The impact staggered him. He stumbled forward, turning to look at him. The moment he realized who he crashed into, his mind went blank. Immediately, he turned to run, but Tetsuo grabbed his arm. Then, silently, he began to walk, dragging Yuji with him. No means no. His fingers dug painfully into Yuji's arm. Yuji could barely keep himself upright. Where was Tetsuo taking him? Up ahead, there was nothing but restrooms and a storage closet. Now that the school had ended for the day, there was no reason for anyone to go this way.
どこへ行く気なんだよ。
No response.
おい
Of their two options, only the restroom could possibly accommodate both of them. What was he planning to do when they got there? Sure enough, Tetsuo proceeded to drag Yuji into the restroom.
なんでこんなところで何を
Yuji dug his heels into the threshold, but to no avail. Tetsuo's vice-like grip prevented his escape. To his shame, Yuji couldn't stop Tetsuo from pushing him into the boys' bathroom. Shoved unceremoniously into the stall, he heard the faint click of the lock sliding into place as Tetsuo stood between him and the door. With the addition of Tetsuo's large frame to the already cramped stall, there was no way out. Tetsuo pressed both hands against the wall on either side of the Yuji, boxing him in completely.
なんでなんなんだよお前
Yuji finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. His throat was so dry he could feel the words stick. He looked into Tetsuo's eyes, but could intuit nothing from his gaze. Interpret? Interpret? Is that how you spell that? No, I thought there was a P in there. Words. On the contrary, it only made him feel more intimidated. Then Tetsuo moved his hand to Yuji's chest. His thick palm slid down his sweater vest to his stomach. Then he felt it descend further.
何やって
He grabbed Tetsuo's arm to try and stop him, but Tetsuo had already unbuckled his belt. Whatever he thought he was doing, Yuji just wanted him to stop.
やめろ
Confused and desperate, Yuji shouted and threw a punch. The dull impact echoed in his fist. Tetsuo fell still. He killed him. Yuji had just hit someone for the first time in his life. The sensation of colliding with flesh and bone lingered in his knuckles, numbing his hand. He had barely moved, yet his chest was heaving as he gasped for breath. Tetsuo's tongue darted out to lick the corner of his mouth, now faintly red and swollen. The next thing Yuji knew, heat exploded on his cheeks as spots of light burst behind his eyelids. It took him a moment to realize that Tetsuo had hit him back. Anger surged before the pain kicked in. He glared up at Tetsuo, but then he heard a voice in his ear.
おとなしくしてろ
The instant he registered those words, a chill shot down his spine as he felt a sharp pain in his gut. Something was swelling inside him. Why did it have to be now? He knew what would happen next. Tetsuo would see. As if he read his mind, Tetsuo wrapped his arm tightly around him. Yuji struggled desperately to escape.
離せ嫌だやめろ
He couldn't think straight. Meanwhile, the fullness inside him continued to expand, and Tetsuo refused to let go. With his arm pinned, Yuji couldn't throw another punch, nor could he protest, as Tetsuo's hand wandered south once more. He unbuckled Yuji's belt and yanked down his slacks and briefs. No, don't touch me. A wave of repulsion overwhelmed him.
嫌だ
He never imagined that this might happen to him, much less at the hands of a younger man. He'd rather have been beaten within an inch of his life. Physical pain was nothing in comparison. This continued. Something inside him, some part of his soul would break. This had to stop before it was too late. But he was unable to defend himself, and that made him long for death.
どうしてなんでこんな
He didn't care who hurt him. As long as he could escape, nothing else mattered. With renewed determination, he struggled against Tetsuo's grip. But his endurance soon reached its limit. A disgusting sense of release spread through his body, and he felt something warm and wet trickle down his thigh. He heard his heart shatter in his breast. It had happened again, and in front of Tetsuo of all people. The chemistry lab incident replayed in his head. He couldn't bear to look up. He wanted desperately to vanish. His body shook with shame and despair. Then he felt something touch his thigh. Just let it end. It was over. Tetsuo had witnessed his shame. Why was he still here? As Yuji hung his head in despair, Tetsuo suddenly reached out and cupped his chin. Next thing he knew, he was looking into those piercing, cold eyes again. Instantly, dark emotion flared in his chest, and he raised his fist once more. But before it could collide with Tetsuo's cheek, it was intercepted by his broad palm. Yuji fixed him with a glare as he summoned all his strength, trying to force his fist through. There were so many things he wanted to say, but was too livid for words.
お前さ
As he held onto Yuji's fist with one hand, Tetsuo raised his other hand to eye level. His fingertips were stained red.
やばいだろこれ
Yuji felt something inside him snap.
だったら
Yes, you're bleeding. He's literally telling you you have a problem. There is blood on his hand. He is saying, yo, dude, look at this. I see the blood. There's a problem. Go to a doctor.
だったらなんで近づくんだよそう思うならほっとけばいいのに
Because
なんで
you're
こんな
Because you're bleeding out your dick. I'm just saying. His voice was shaking, but he couldn't stop.
何が目的なんだよ何なんだよもうほっとけよこれ以上関わらないでくれ
A deafening crash cut Yuji off. Tetsuo had punched the wall next to his head. Behind those unfeeling eyes shone an icy blue light that froze Yuji to the core. Fear ran down his spine like a drop of frigid water. Tetsuo straightened up and released Yuji's hand. But Yuji was rooted to the spot. Then Tetsuo turned and left without another word. The faint click of his wallet chain faded with his footsteps. After Tetsuo was gone, Yuji collapsed to his knees. For a while, he just stared into space. Then finally, he staggered to his feet and got dressed. He couldn't think. His body was on autopilot as it carried him from the stall. With the tension finally gone, the pain in his cheek suddenly came into a sharp focus. It felt sore and bruised, but nothing seemed to be broken. Tetsuo must have let him off with a slap. Not only had Tetsuo copped a feel, but he barely had to work for it. The thought made Yuji furious. He hated himself for being so weak. As he hung his head in shame, he noticed his book bag laying on the floor. Tetsuo must have left it there. He slung it over his shoulder. It felt like a ton of bricks. Stumbling out of the boys' bathroom, Yuji headed for the shoe locker, changed shoes, and left the building. Dusk had fallen, and the campus was dyed in a mix of dull colors. Beneath the darkening sky, Yuji passed through the gate and headed for the train station. As soon as he arrived home, Yuji tossed his book bag to the floor and collapsed into the bed. He didn't want to think about anything. He didn't want to remember. He lay there still as a corpse for what felt like hours, then suddenly he felt a damp warmth on his leg. He knew it could only mean something unpleasant, but he barely had the energy to get up. Sluggishly, he forced his body out of bed. He felt neither panic nor surprise. Instead, he was perfectly calm. Unbuckling his belt, he slowly lowered his briefs, along with his slacks. Sure enough, there was a dark red stain in his underwear. Blood, probably. Even now he felt no surprise. This had become almost normal for him. Stepping out of his pants, Yuji picked up his underwear and headed to the bathroom. He walked straight past the sink to the washing machine, tossed his briefs in, and started it up. The lights were off. The room was dark. The quiet hum of the motor echoed in his eardrums, reminiscent of a buzzing fly. Grasping the washing machine with both hands, he closed his eyes and contemplated the bloodstain. It spread like paint in his mind, slowly resolving into a different image. The incident in the boys' bathroom earlier today. At times like this, his mind always replayed the memory frame by frame in perfect detail. He closed his eyes to fight it. He didn't want to remember. With a sigh, Yuji turned his gaze to the display light on the washing machine. For the time being, he wanted to keep his mind blank. He was in no mood to face reality right now. He stood there for some time after that, alone in the dark with his thoughts and rhythmic hum of the motor. Late that night, Makoto was riding his bike down the deserted road. His pet beagle, Mary, was beside him on her leash, her tongue lolling as she ran full speed. Makoto always took her for a walk after he got home from work. He had adopted her from the family friend when she was just a puppy. She was his responsibility, and it was his job to look after her whenever he wasn't at school. The night was much more pleasant than it had been during the day. Makoto had worked up a sweat, and the breeze felt good. As Mary paused to sniff a utility pole, he slowed to a stop, inhaling deeply. The air smelled of plants and water, like the dewy meadow. It was a summery scent that reminded him of the changing seasons.
行くぞ、メリー。
He tugged gently on the beagle's leash and put his feet back on the pedals. Tonight he was taking the scenic route for a change. Biking past the train station after his, he rode on another 10 minutes until the white apartment building came into view. He came to a stop a short distance away and stared up at the walls.
幼児。
The man fell from his lips. The name fell from his lips. Yuji seemed different these days. It felt like something else was going on with him, something not related to his health. But Yuji never talked about it. Whenever Makoto tried to ask about him, about his condition, the dark-haired youth would just shake his head and say that he was fine. It made Makoto want to rip his own hair out. Yuji's condition seemed to be getting worse, too. He never used to be quite so pallid and listless. Irrational though it was, Makoto couldn't help but worry that he might disappear one day. He couldn't bear to see Yuji this way. If there were anything he could do to help, he'd do it. He just wished Yuji would reach out to him. Makoto gazed forlorningly up to the building. As the night breeze washed over him, he started to feel more and more pathetic. What was he doing, acting like a stalker? Ashamed, he clicked his tongue and turned away from the building. Wrapping Mary's leash around his waist once more, Makoto put his feet back out to the pedals. But just then, a car approached, with its blinkers on. Makoto watched as it pulled over right outside of Yuji's building.
Mm-hmm.
The car was perfectly ordinary, but something about it struck Makoto as suspicious. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Makoto squinted at him. He looked vaguely familiar. Then it hit him. He did recognize the man. It was Zenya's chauffeur. The man was staring up at Yuji's building, smoking a cigarette with a grimace on his face. Maybe the smoke was getting in his eyes. It didn't look like anyone else was in the car. Suspicion arose in Makoto's gut. Why would Zenya's chauffeur come to Yuji's apartment? Yuji had been in the same year as Zenya until he got held back. That could explain how Zenya might know him. But he couldn't imagine how they might be connected beyond that. Besides, it didn't make sense for the chauffeur to come here by himself. Maybe Zenya was having Yuji followed? It wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. Xenia was a weirdo. His actions never made sense. Maybe on the off chance this theory was right, it would be best to let Yuji know before something serious happened. Makoto's mind was racing, faster than it ever did in class. Distracted, he completely failed to notice Mary growling next to him. Her bark shattered the silence. Makoto flinched and then froze in place, like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over his head. The chauffeur turned to look at his direction, cigarette pinched between his fingers.
やべ
Hastily, Makoto grabbed the bike handlebars and sped off in the opposite direction, taking care not to tangle Mary's leash. He pedaled like crazy until he was gasping for breath. All he could think was getting the hell out of there. The scenery passed in a blur. The next thing he knew, he was back in his own neighborhood. His house wasn't too far off now. He glanced down at the leash and realized that Mary was running as fast as her little legs could carry her.
ごめんちょっときつかったかな
In his panic, he hadn't given a thought to his poor dog. Sensing he might have pushed her too hard, he parked immediately. Mary began to pant, tongue still lolling, all the while wagging her tail happily for some reason.
お前さっきなんで吠えたんだよたぶん
Good doggo. He chided the dog, but deep down he knew she hadn't meant any harm by it. If anything, he was the one to blame. Makoto put his hands on the handlebars and heaved a long sigh. Thinking back on what he'd just witnessed, he couldn't help but frown. The least he could do was get in touch with Yuji. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. Yuji needed to know right away. But before he could place the call, Makoto stopped short. He didn't know Yuji's number. He had his email address, but the rest of the connection info was blank. In that instance, Makoto felt like a complete and total failure. Why had he assumed he knew Yuji's number? All of his other friends had given him both email addresses and phone numbers, but not Yuji. Actually, it was more than that. Thinking about it, Makoto realized that he had hardly known anything about Yuji. Not that he needed to know all the details of his life, but weren't they supposed to be friends? Come to think of it, Yuji almost never talked about himself. How did Yuji really feel about him? He'd never stopped to consider it before now. As he pondered this revelation, Makoto suddenly felt a tug on the leash. Mary was looking up at him and pacing impatiently for her walk to resume.
ごめんなちょっと待ってろよ
He needed to pull himself together. But, for the time being, he'd send Yuji a quick email. It was something, at least. Once it was sent, Makoto set off on his bike once more, his heart full of thorns. He was probably just freaking out over nothing. Yuji didn't like to talk about himself much. It was nothing more than that. Still. No, he needed to stop thinking about it. Shaking away his anxiety, Makoto squinted at the streetlights ahead of him. No point in obsessing. Thinking wasn't his strong suit anyway. He'd just talk to Yuji about it tomorrow at school. With that settled, Makoto headed home. Well, things are getting very interesting. But that, my friends, is where we're going to leave it. If I can hit the save button. Which is that button. So thank you guys for joining me for more of Sweet Pool. I'm glad to have it back and have my save back. See y'all next time. Bye, guys.